And that's the thing that everyone's going banana sandwich over right now. That's what ChatGPT is based on, and that's what the latest version of GPT-3 in the OpenAI playground is based on. It's this thing called Instruct GPT, which is GPT-3 shaped by human feedback.
I was thinking to talk to you about the process of interviewing people, because you're one of my favorite.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I have tons to say on this topic, both as a journalist and as a AI practitioner.
When is the role of host and guest done because like the AI takes over? Because like, is that 6 months out or like 60 years? I don't know.
Yeah, totally.
But I thought maybe your project would kind of explore that stuff a little bit. Well, thank you for joining. Welcome to the show, John.
Yay. Hey.
So we were just talking about the idea of interviewing, and your obviously background as a journalist is useful there. But then we've also been talking about your projects around AI as an interviewer. And I thought there's just like a ton to explore in like what makes a human interviewer good, what makes an AI interviewer good, and sort of where do all these things intersect and overlap, and sort of what's your take on the world? Because you're both a practitioner of interviewing and a practitioner of AI.
Yeah. So that's what's so fun about this topic is that it's the reverse of the Turing test. This just occurred to me in this very moment.
Right.
So the Turing test is a human interviewing an AI to figure out if it's human or an AI. And, we've kind of chalked that up as a big milestone for AI, although a lot of people poo-poo that because as devised, the Turing test encourages engineers to make essentially deceptive chatbots that don't have to be that clever. They just have to fool an unwary human interviewer into not realizing they're talking to a machine, fooling them into not asking the hard questions and so forth. All that aside, what you're proposing is actually really intriguing. It's a reverse. It's not really a reverse Turing test. I'm not sure even what that would mean, but it's a close cousin of the Turing test.
Right.
It is, can you make a computer into a good interviewer of humans? Mm-hmm. And that's actually a really intriguing question because I've been thinking recently about how I could truly automate what I used to do as a professional journalist. Mm-hmm. So there's the whole writing part, and the whole world of AI is like on fire with automating the writing side. That's what GPT-3 is all about.
Right.
Something not many people have been talking about, to my knowledge, is how do you automate the job of an interviewer? So, why do you interview someone? In some sense, like, it's to extract information. It's like we want to get some information out of this human, and so we need to do this process, this operation called an interview to get it out of them. And the world abounds with this, right? That's what customer service is, right? Some potentially angry human is calling a number, and you fire up your bots, and their job number one is to find out what's the problem.
Right.
It's a kind of interview. It's a very primitive interview. And we used to use, we used to do these menus, right? Dial 1 for blah, dial 2 for blah. It's an interview in a very primitive sense.
Yeah.
But now with GPT-3 and ChatGPT and whatever comes next, the exciting possibility is suddenly here that we could have interviews that are more akin to a human interview. Maybe even open-ended. That's where it gets really interested, where you don't even know what you want to get out of this human. Mm-hmm. You just need to interview them and find out. Right. Maybe the objective is get their life story. Maybe it's what are they feeling? What are they thinking? Now we're starting to get into the territory that I'm familiar with as a human interviewer, the big wide open plane of human interaction. This is where things get exciting.
Were there things in your background as an interviewer that, did you feel like you had well-trodden trails that you would go on, or kind of structures and frameworks that you would visit from time to time, or was it more, things were more, well-researched but then ad hoc in the moment?
When I was working as a professional journalist, there were several different modes that I would click into when I would do an interview with someone. So sometimes on one end of the extreme, I just need an answer to a question, very specific. And I don't know what that answer will be. It's not like I need to know, like, I'm looking for the number 42. Sometimes it's like, I don't know exactly what the answer is going to be, but I know what question I'm driving at. And so it becomes like the driving narrative of the interview. It's like, for example, I once did this interview in China, in a factory. Your wife, Jen, knows all about this. She loves this story. It was one of my earliest experiences as a journalist, as a professional journalist. I traveled to China to go to this factory in a city called Dalian, towards the border with North Korea. And I met this German entrepreneur, scientist named Gunther von Hagens, who had moved from Germany to China and set up this whole operation where he was taking dead human bodies, cadavers, and turning them into artworks, and anatomical artworks, with a show that he traveled around the world called Body Worlds. And I had a driving question, one ultimate question that I wanted the answer to, which was, where are you getting these bodies? And really, the subtext was, underneath all this, was, are you getting these bodies from the Chinese government? And really below that is the ultimate question, are you getting these bodies from prisons and insane asylums? Because rumors were swirling that that's exactly why he moved to China, and that's where he was getting his bodies. By the way, the answer is yes. Yes, wow. And yes, he was indeed getting bodies from there. He's now passed away, so it's not even that controversial anymore. But at the time, it was like crazy. And so you can imagine how electrifying. Yes, that was my mission. And that's not like the story I told getting in there, like, because I had to get permission on all kinds of levels to get over there and get in there. But that was the question that was driving my interview. I really wanted the answer to that question. And ultimately I got it, not from him, but from the people working in his factory. Just like a bunch of med school grads, or even still in med school, types who didn't realize that this was sensitive information. Right. So imagine like we try and like teach an AI to have these like missions within missions within missions and go and like, operationally, it's the kind of thing that ChatGPT should be capable of today. Ask a series of questions. It's really like, in the parlance of natural language processing, it's like send a string, get a string, calculate, send another string, get a string. It's like question, answer, question, answer. It should be pretty straightforward, but like the mental model that allows a really sophisticated interviewer to like duck and weave through all of that with like nested missions and being able to adapt. I don't think we're there yet. I know we're not there yet.
You really have to understand what your counterparty understands and thinks and what their position. Like it sounds like you were able to get the kind of grad student types to reveal the final bit of information, but unless you kind of had already warmed them up and already knew kind of the context on who they were, it probably would have
exactly. And it required a series of interviews. I needed to get a whole bunch of context from the big guy in order to go and talk to the little guys, in order to just kind of duck my weave to the answer I wanted. Right. No way can we do that today with ChatGPT or anything. No way can an AI do that.
Did you go in having an hypothesis of what you thought the answer was, and you were kind of trying to... Of
course. Oh, yeah. Like, that's what drove the story in my mind. That's what kind of makes it fun to be a journalist, in part, is you're writing the story as you live it. And so the choices you make about who to talk to and what questions to ask are largely unconsciously driven by the narrative. It's like you're bringing your reader along, your future readers. It's like you're bringing your future readers along as you have these experiences, so that you can tell an authentic story that's driven by the facts as they unfolded. But it's very subjective in the sense that you're deciding on the basis of what's going to be a compelling story and what's going to like unravel the mystery or unveil the most impactful truth. As you go, it's like you're free jazzing your way through. Like maybe halfway through, the thing that drove you here in the first place turns out to not even be as interesting as something revealed in the moment, and you kind of swerve off, and now you're on a new track. Mm-hmm. How do we capture all that with AI? I have no idea.
Yeah, it almost seems, I hadn't ever really thought about journalism as such a creative art, but I think this thing you're speaking to feels like it's very creative how you decide to prosecute that particular question then.
Or at least it's very human.
It's very
human. I mean, I think it's very creative, but only in as much as being so creative is very human. You know, like, let's say I wasn't a journalist. I don't know, there's some kerfuffle in your family. You know, here's something that a lot of people watching this could relate to, even if they've never had any experience being a journalist or anything like that. People in your family are upset about something. You don't really understand what's going on. You know who's upset, you know who's involved, but you don't have the details. And you have to go and kind of like fix the problem. How do you do that? You know, the mechanisms are very much the same. You're going to go talk to people, interview them, get information, adapt based on what you get, ask different questions, talk to different people depending upon which direction the narrative takes you. So again, I just think this is so beyond what AI can do today. GPT-3 can generate the next thing to say, and that's pretty much it. It's super impressive at doing that task of, given what we've talked about so far, what's the very next thing I should say? That's what it was trained to do, after all.
And that's GPT-3, but I think I've heard the rumblings that GPT-4 is even more impressive in a bunch of ways, and 3.5.
Totally.
Are those making steps on that path toward what you're describing would make a better interviewer, or are they kind of optimizing?
I think it makes them ever more sophisticated at figuring out what to say next. It could reach the point where it's as sophisticated as a human. Maybe it's indistinguishable from a human in terms of what to say next. But there's more to the art of interviewing than what to say next. To give you like an example of that, let's say that, there I am. Let's say that you replace me in China, back in the day with some AI. So I have an earphone. It's like Ratatouille. I'm just doing what my rat tells me in my hat.
Right.
So, they're none the wiser, but every word that comes out of my mouth is coming from some AI model. How good would that AI model have to be able to, like, not just say the right thing in the next moment, but set up like the next interview, realize like the next person to talk to and what to ask them is X rather than Y. For that, you need to not just have the context of what you've talked about so far. So until we come up with some totally different AI neural architecture, we're stuck with this thing called the transformer, which means you're stuck with this thing called the attention window, which means it's akin to the human working memory. So as we're talking, like, you can remember everything I've said for the past, whatever, N minutes. And beyond that, you have to dip into something like deeper, long-term memory. These models have no such thing. They're like amnesiacs. As soon as like you talk long enough that the words of the previous dialogue are too big to fit in that attention window, it's like gone, and it doesn't remember anything. Now, people are actively trying to solve that right now, and word is OpenAI is actively working on this. I actually have an inside source that they are indeed building exactly this, something akin to a longer-term memory. So how would that work? So, you've got this computer program running with this big neural network, and it's feeding in this big string, this big blob of text, which is everything you've said so far. And it uses that to calculate what to say next. But back here is like the whole history of everything you've talked about with this person and perhaps everything you've ever said to anyone. It's like that adds up, as the psychologists say, to who you are. Who are you if not your memory? And so what they're doing is they're building these database systems that index all of these utterances from your past and created a harness for the model to be able to retrieve what's relevant and stick it literally in that attention window in a little dedicated spot, so that it could consider memories as it goes. Who knows if that's how humans do it, but like, it's analogous. And I've actually been working on that with a brilliant engineer named Sam Whitmore. And she's got a little startup that's off and away building this core technology. But these are such early days. And I can tell you it's really hard. Really hard.
Is it hard from like architecture or like computation or storage or some of everything?
There's at least two aspects that strike me as super hard. One is how to figure out what's relevant. So, for example, in the moment that I said, figure out what's relevant, presumably your brain somehow analogously is picking up relevant, deep memory context. Maybe the word relevant cues it up. Maybe like something more sophisticated. But like right now in your mind, you have access to long-term memories, but like on the fly. Who knows how many are being like considered in real time.
Right.
You know, it's got to be more sophisticated than what we're coding up with these AIs, I tell you. But so the first problem is just like, how do you figure out what's relevant? How do you retrieve what's relevant to any given moment? And then the second problem is, even if you had a perfect, quote unquote, perfect system, so in any given moment, while you're thinking or talking or walking along, the perfectly relevant thing from your deep storage gets served up and available. Mm-hmm. So let's just like dream that problem solved. You still have the problem of this higher level thing, which is what I was kind of hinting at with the kind of how do you decide the right strategy in the first place? Here I am in China, and I've just been talking to this weird German scientist, and he drops a little clue, and I realize in that moment, I now know that if I like went out to the factory floor and I asked a certain series of questions in just the right way, with just the right framing, I could probably get the answer to the deep question I'm truly after.
Right.
That isn't just a matter of like retrieving some string from your memory from some old conversation. That's like a whole mental model.
Right.
Coupled with some like strategy, I don't know, model that's running. I have no idea how to even represent that in code.
Right.
And so this is the bigger problem that AI is facing is how do you make true kind of flesh and blood agents in a virtual sense who like have strategies and desires and cares. You know, they want to achieve certain things. So this is like a great divide right now between natural language processing and I guess the rest of AI that cares about things called goals. Transformers, so GPT-3 included, they have no goals. They have no desires. They have no preferences per se. So there's this whole other part of AI called reinforcement learning that has a very crystallized sense of like goals and trying to achieve something. And then you have this other really exciting but totally separate part of AI, which is all about like sensors and processing and prediction. So it's like language comes in, language comes out. Images come in, language comes out, or images come out, or classification comes out. And they're like two different worlds. I presume that sooner or later, they're all going to come together and we're going to start to build beings, agents in the world who not only have the sophistication of like GPT-3 and, you know, Stable Diffusion and whatever else, but they have the kind of sophisticated goal setting and strategy making of DeepMind's reinforcement learning agents. I think it's a matter of a few years.
So do we need like new breakthroughs for each of these categories? Like we need a big breakthrough in reinforcement learning, kind of akin to the transformer, or
maybe not. Maybe it's just a matter of someone kind of mixing the ingredients.
Get a few breakthroughs in a
so
few
something
domains,
I would
and the rest of it kind of comes together.
I don't know. I mean, so totally out of my depth here. I'm just like speculating at this point.
Yeah, sure.
Did you see that cool thing from the Google team called that works on robots called SayCan?
I didn't see that. What's SayCan?
So I was really impressed with that. So the idea is like you've got this robot, and they actually have this actual robot at Google that's, you know, it can only do simple actions, but you know it's got an arm and it can move around the room. But they created a framework for it called SayCan, as in say stuff and I can do stuff, and they put it together into SayCan. And the idea is that you take one of these big sophisticated language models that knows how to read language and spew language, and you get it to propose actions. Like the famous example that they gave, now famous example is, I've just spilled this Coke. Can you help me clean it up? If you pose that as a problem to a typical robot, it doesn't even know where to begin. Robots today need kind of strict actions that are in its vocabulary of actions it can execute. And so what was really clever is they got a language model kind of like upstream of that to figure out what are the plausible actions given the goal. If your goal is to clean up this mess from the Coke, what are the things I can do? And what are the sequence of things? This is where it gets really clever. Well, first you would go get a cloth. Then you would come over to where the spill is. Then you would apply the cloth to the spill. It's like a series of actions, and then something else translates that into something the robot can actually execute. So that's to me, the most exciting recent example of taking these very different cognitive capabilities that are right now living in different AI neighborhoods, starting to bring them together into something like a coherent thinking, acting agent.
Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like one example of a bridge. How many disparate domains would you say there are, just roughly? Like, we've got these language things, we've got robotics, we've got RL. Are these? Is there half
computer
a dozen?
Vision?
Mm-hmm. CV is another. Yeah.
We've got the world of audio, which is still a different neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you seen, by the way, the? I don't know if this just came out, but have you seen the enhanced speech podcast AI thing from Adobe?
No.
They have this. I just found it this morning. I don't know I can't tell if it either was just released now or came out a year ago, but it's amazing. I've been sort of recording these little bits and stuff, and sometimes people have crappy mics or whatever, and they can take anything. Actually, we took the Founders Used to Know show from last week. I ran all of the audio tracks. I stripped them out and I put them through this, and they all sound like they were recorded on a Shure SM7B, a $400 microphone in a studio.
Whoa!
Setting.
And of course,
so
if you hook that up to the model that was open sourced by OpenAI called Whisper, I'll bet you get gorgeous actual text.
Oh yeah.
It wouldn't know who's
Whisper,
who.
If I understand. Right. But Whisper, if I understand right, it's basically taking the same statistical prediction that makes GPT-3 work and applying it to kind of the speech-to-text transcription. Is that right? Gosh,
I don't know. I haven't had a chance to read the paper or ask anyone about it. All I know is that it blows away all other speech-to-text systems before it.
Yeah.
Because not only does it get the right words, but it figures out the punctuation. And it does this in multiple languages, which is mind-blowing. And in noisy situations. So.
Right. So there's the Whisper stuff is, I think, going to make big moves. The Adobe audio AI is a big thing in audio. What else is happening in audio? Because you mentioned it's kind of a big category that doesn't have as much.
Yeah, what else is going on in audio? Nothing that I know of. But, I mean, it's only a matter of time before video gets to become the data paradise that it is. Mm-hmm. It's amazing that we're not quite there yet. You can't turn video into any kind of data structure that you can do really cool things on yet. For example, you can't query a video. Let's imagine a model where you can just feed it a video, and then you can just talk to the model about the video, and it just fluently, as if it were a human, talks about the things that happened and what's going on and who's who and who said, not just who said what, but why, and just do question answering on the video. That's coming for sure.
Right. It kind of touches on what's the state of the summarization of text. Do we have pretty good tools for that today?
I've worked on that a lot. It's in some ways amazingly, let's call it solved, and in some ways it's stubbornly unsolved. So in the ways that it's solved, so I started working on text summarization in 2017 at Primer, the startup that I'm still at. And we didn't have transformers. Frankly, we didn't have machine learning. Machine learning was just not a thing in natural language processing. But we had very, very hard-won, clever statistical tools. And one of them was this technique where you can make a summary from a document by breaking it up into sentences, and then this algorithm that you would apply to the text would rank those sentences by how important they are to the document. And you can imagine what goes into this. It's like, well, what are the words? It's not just words, but something we call n-grams, which can be longer than a word. But it's essentially saying, well, let's judge importance by how often the words that appear in your sentence appear elsewhere, minus the words that appear everywhere. So it's sort of like, what are the most special words to this document, and how many of those occur in your sentence? And so that algorithm allows you to rank the sentences by their importance to the document. And then you just it's just like inverse documents frequency, IDF, exactly. It's like, how special are these n-grams to this document within each sentence, treating each sentence as a document and the whole document as a corpus. And so out comes this ranking, and then you just choose a magic number. We chose 3 back in the day. Choose the top 3 sentences, preserve order if you can, otherwise, re-rank them. If they're all together contiguously, then just grab that. But if they're like all over the document, then just, do them by rank. And, the funny thing is when you apply that to a modern English language news article, which is where all these systems were tested and, largely where they're used, it's kind of magically good. The dirty trick, and I knew this as soon as I got into this field because of my background as a journalist, I realized this algorithm is essentially an algorithm for finding what we call the nut graph. So the nut graph in journalism is the usually second or third paragraph of a news article that summarizes the whole article. And the reason it exists is because back in the day, journalists would publish in something called paper, usually in a big thing called a newspaper, which had a certain structure. And you would fold it in half, and the front would be the headline and the major stories. And then if you open that piece of paper, everything below that crease is called under the fold. And so you were taught as a journalist when you're writing sort of what's called news stories, as opposed to feature stories, which are more narrative. You got to get that nut graph high up after your lead, which for no good reason is spelled L-E-D-E, which is essentially the beginning of your story, how you draw readers in. But as soon as you get them in, you've got to deliver the news. And the news is encapsulated in this paragraph called the nut graph. It's the sort of nut of the story. And so sure enough, this algorithm correctly identifies that the collection of little sentences in that paragraph is a good encapsulation of the whole story. And so all of natural language processing, this whole field, fooled itself into thinking that this algorithm was a reliable summarization technology. And we learned the hard way, just like everyone else is, when you apply this to documents that have nothing to do with news articles, they have a very different structure, it doesn't work that well. It really generates a bunch of crap. But when you apply it to news, it's kind of magical. And so that's where summarization was circa 2017, 2018. And then everything changed when BERT came out in 2018. And starting from, I'd say, 2019 onwards, summarization started to become actually really interesting. I'd say 2020 onwards is where it just got crazy good, because we threw out this old statistical technique. No more ranking of sentences. You don't even have to break up sentences. You don't even have to worry about grammar. That's what's wonderful about it. Forget linguistics. Forget what verbs are and nouns. You don't have to even care. Instead, you just have this giant neural network that's been trained to predict what comes next. What should I say next, given what I've said so far? So you give it a paragraph or a document or even just a sentence. You lop it in half, and you say, predict what comes next. That's all it's been trained on. And it turns out you can take that model with that skill that it's learned by doing that at internet scale, and then you can fine tune it on a relatively small data set of summaries. And the go-to data set, which to this day we still use, is called the CNN Daily Mail data set. It is a web scrape of two news websites, CNN and Daily Mail, where human journalists like me, days of yore, part of your daily job after you published your story was to, I don't know if the journalists or their editors wrote this. I think the journalists, honestly. It sounds like such a journalist task. You have to like write a bullet point summary of your own story. And that was part of the package that they published to make it easier for internet consumers to like just digest all this news. If you don't even want to read the story, you could just read my 3 bullet point summary. And so we use that as training data to take that text-to-text model and make it good at summarizing. So given a document, generate those roughly typically 3 to 5 bullet point, summaries.
Right.
And it's just so good. It's astoundingly good. And it's abstractive. This is a technical term, meaning you don't have to strictly cut and paste sentences from the story. You can you can be free. You can be loosey-goosey, like a human author. You can summarize it and paraphrase it in a way that might include words that aren't even mentioned in the article.
Right. Because the old Ngram technique was very focused on like a specific sentence that kind of really summarized the nut.
Yep. You had to Franken cut and paste sentences from the article into a summary. And you can imagine the ways that fails inevitably are like loss of context. It's a he said, she said, and you don't know who he or she is. Or it's an awkward sentence that includes a bunch of extra junk that isn't relevant to the summary. Like human writing. It's not clean and reusable.
And so the new kind of more abstract ability that's enabled by BERT?
It's enabled by BERT and all of the transformer models that came after it, where you are able to take a big piece of text, stuff it into that context attention window, and just figure out what to say next. And the king of the bunch is GPT-3. And I can say that not only theoretically, but just empirically, having used it as a practitioner. The thing is just so damn good. And what changed dramatically was just over the past year with this twist called Instruct GPT. So when GPT-3 came out, it was mind-blowing, but it was hard to use. It was really hard to use. You would give it instructions, say, hey, do this thing, and it would just ignore you and just vomit a bunch of fluent but irrelevant English language text. And then they figured out how to use reinforcement learning, a special version of reinforcement learning called RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback, to basically take users' feedback on the model and turn that into basically a system, we can get into the details if you're interested, to shape the way the model outputs text. So this is a brand new paradigm for natural language processing. Rather than, if you want it to do X, some useful task, you'd have to go make data for X. You'd have to make a bunch of training data and then train the damn thing. Now, the new paradigm is, these things are so smart, just assume that it can do it. The skill is in there, hidden somewhere. It's smart enough. And so if it's misbehaving and not doing what you want, don't give it training data. Just work with it and tell it which of its possible outputs, given any step in your task, are your favorite. And it slowly but surely it learns your preferences and applies it to itself. So that's the new paradigm, is just treat the human user as the data.
And is the human feedback loop in RLHF, is it always generalized across the data set, or it's always personalized to a specific interaction?
Well, good question. So what we've done so far in the field that has made a big splash is kind of a universal human. What they did, OpenAI is the they here, they actually hired a bunch of actual humans to go and look at the possible things that, so Let me put it this way. They took thousands of instances where actual users of GPT-3, OpenAI's implementation of GPT-3, where people asked it to do something, and then the model did stuff. And what they did was they recreated the possible things the model could have said in each of those instances in response to the request. And then they put those in front of these trained, paid humans and said, rank these. Which one's the best? They did a bunch of other stuff as well to fight like hate speech and all kinds of other problems. But the core, most important thing they did to achieve Instruct GPT was to capture these preferences with this human feedback. So like, you said this, but you could have said this. And actually, this would have been better. It would have been more fitting to what the human was actually asking for. For example, when the human said, can you summarize this news article? You summarized it this way, but actually this way would have been better. And look, that was your like number 3 choice. You would have generated that, but you just didn't. So that would have been better. And so they captured thousands and thousands of instances of this feedback. And they used this technique called reinforcement learning to basically guide the training of this model so that it is more attendant to the human's instructions, and it's more faithful to the goals of the humans. So it does what you say, and it has a better model of what you really want. And the results are astounding. I mean, it was just night and day. I had no faith in GPT-3 a year ago. I was like, cute but useless. Now I'm like, okay, this is going to launch 1,000 startups.
And so,
because you can actually use this thing.
Is the version of GPT-3 that has RLHF embedded in it?
Yep. And that's the thing that everyone's going banana sandwich over right now. That's what ChatGPT is based on, and that's what the latest version of GPT-3 in the OpenAI playground is based on. It's this thing called Instruct GPT, which is GPT-3 shaped by human feedback.
In the human feedback, you mentioned they're the paid people who are going through this process of choosing, choice 1, 2, or 3, and kind of evaluating and rating them. Is there any hypothesis or proposal for how the end user experience could be part of that feedback loop?
That's the dream. And that's what everyone knows is the next big thing, which is rather than that generic big population of hired humans to represent sort of all humans, we could have a Cambrian explosion of chat or GPT-3 text-to-text models that you can tune to any population or even individual human for any particular need. And so now it's just a question of how cheap and efficient can you make that? And I have to say, OpenAI is way ahead of the curve on this. I used to think that their position was super brittle. Like, as a company, like such a bad position to be in, because this renegade group of engineers calling themselves Eleuther had just like made an open source version of GPT-3 called GPT Neo. And so the whole world was just like kind of in turmoil in a delightful way. It was like, oh, we don't have to like go to OpenAI's API to get this magic. It's been unleashed. Pandora's box is open. But my opinion has kind of softened a bit because in light of how impressive GPT-3 is now after this reinforcement learning technique. And that is something that OpenAI has that no one else has, which is the history of millions of users interacting with their system. That is data gold.
Right. And is there a credible number 2 in your mind, like a number 2 or number 3, like as Eleuther? Do they have any credibility as a number 2, or kind of different techniques or approaches, or more open? Kind of what the role that Stability AI plays, with Stable Diffusion relative to, say, like DALL-E 2. Is there an equivalent open direction for LLMs?
Well, Eleuther have teamed up with Hugging Face and Scale.ai, I believe. I could be totally wrong about this, but I think this is largely right. I remember an announcement that they're working on an open source version of InstructGPT. So that could change the game yet again. Another big player in this space is DeepMind, which is Google, which is Alphabet.
Yeah.
They are consistently coming out with just absolutely paradigm changing new AI. The most recent thing they came out with was Flamingo. That blew my mind. So have you heard of this thing?
Flamingo? No, I haven't seen that.
Oh my God, it's pretty cool. So this is computer vision, but it's computer vision married to natural language processing in a really cool new way. So you can give this thing an image and then just talk to the model about the image. It's as if you had a natural language processing model as powerful as GPT-3 that could also see. And so you could like show it an image and you could just like talk about the things in that image and reason over it. Just like I were showing you an image and we could both see it and talk about it. So that makes me really excited that DeepMind is also a big player in this space in general, and they might just disrupt as well and bring new stuff in and maybe hopefully open source it.
Yeah, I've heard rumor that their stuff in some ways is far ahead of anything else we've seen in the market, but I think given the kind of brand risk that Google Alphabet would have, exposing it to the market without the right safety guardrails or training, it's something that they've been slow about. So I wonder if that's either like going to strategically be, maybe it's valuable in that it looks a little bit more like a closed system that they use to build better search, or maybe it instigates a more open system. Is it Apple? Is it iOS or is it Android?
We shall see. We shall see. Although a super trend that I've been noticing is just the accelerating nature of this release cycle. So, when GPT-3 came out, or even GPT-2, so, the predecessor to GPT-3, there was this much to do about, we've got this new model. They published a paper, but they wouldn't release the model because it was too dangerous. Couldn't say what people would do with it. And so they waited a good while. And then, then came DALL-E in the computer vision side. And, they waited a while. But the time between some new capability being debuted and either a fully open source or a almost no strings attached API access for the thing, that time, that latency is getting smaller and smaller. Is what I'm not the only one to notice this. It's accelerating, which means I mean, unless something dramatically different happens, and I've got an idea for what could cause a difference, it will just start to approach real-time release, and the world will get to use this stuff as it's getting discovered, more or less. Something that would change that is a moral panic.
Right.
So this is something we discussed at that dinner.
Yeah. Right.
and I agree. I think if we have a true crisis with AI, the one we were discussing, I think, was deepfakes, but this could apply to anything. Some new capability gets created and unleashed on the world, either on purpose or accidentally, and it gets used in some incredibly nefarious way, or some unintentional mishap occurs with terrible consequences. We could have an AI moral panic where the world kind of wakes up and suddenly we've got regulation and we've got criminal consequences and we could be putting on the brakes real fast. But until that happens, it looks like it's only going to get faster and faster in front of us and changing our world.
Right. And if it does get sort of a brake put on, regulatory or otherwise through moral panic, it seems like there's still a lot of computation and a very different kind of worldview or philosophy in China that could, sort of unbreak the same set of problems. So it almost feels like once it's discovered, are we not just going to have to figure out how to deal with it?
True. There's also the layer of geopolitical complexity.
Right.
But and something that's been on my mind, for example, is with all this sophisticated chat progress, imagine being able to create agents that can go and live and exist on the internet indistinguishably from us, humans on the internet. So not only can you go and obviously get on Twitter and say stuff, but you could, for example, take part in surveys and polls.
Right.
Imagine that you could spin up a small army of fake citizens on the internet. So in Western democracies, there is this enshrined practice of we call it public feedback period. When there's going to be a new policy, a new law, something, there has to be a period where you get public feedback. And often this takes the form of surveys and also surveys and polls and general feedback happen, spontaneously, ad hoc in other realms where it's really important. It also, of course, happens in product feedback, reviews and so forth from movies or on Amazon.com, whatever. If all of that can be mass manipulated by armies of fake agents, we're going to have a moral crisis. It's just inevitable. We're going to have some huge consequence akin to the Russian meddling with the U.S. election.
Right.
In
Do you think there are
2016.
Safeguards, or kind of like, you could imagine if we see that coming or when that happens, we start to trust the world, trust what we read on the internet less because we know that it's manipulated or
That's
easily
one
manipulated?
possible direction. That's one possible direction. That's a very expensive direction. Another possibility is that we fall back on old methods of authenticity signaling. So, for example, nothing can be anonymous anymore on the internet. Everything gets tied to your Apple ID or your ID with Google or something like that. And it just gets more and more locked down, and power gets consolidated into a few big players who essentially run the internet, or the government.
Right.
You literally have a government issued driver's license to be on the internet.
Right.
In the limit, that's where we could end up. So
I've
you either give up on truth or you give up on anonymity. Both have huge consequences.
Right. And do you see one as more likely than the other, or it's just kind of very path dependent? Because we have the ability today to, we can cryptographically sign our transactions, right? We could create a
but that means nothing if you don't know who the person is behind the signing.
Right. So if you imagine some further off future where a bunch of things happen, but if you know that you met me on this video chat and you feel like this is the real DK, you could say, I trust that that's the real one in a messenger, like Signal has this kind of feature. And then in the future, whenever I message from that thing, it signs with my private key that I am that same person that you had that video conference with.
I don't think that's what's at risk, though. Me knowing who you are is not what it's at risk. It's rather an organization like the government or a company not knowing who anyone is in general, or you, as a citizen on the internet, not knowing what the true democratic, what the people are thinking on X.
Okay. So it's more the numbers game of understanding population.
I think so.
Things,
I don't think it's a deep fake problem, because I think you're exactly right. If we can have cryptographic signatures, I feel like that's a solved problem. It's we can protect that. I think that's already protectable. It's rather, synthetically, it's what Chomsky used to call manufacturing consent.
Right.
I guess he probably still says that. I think he's still alive.
This is how we got.
It's a great phrase, though.
Bodie McBoatface. Do you remember the?
Well, that was a crowdsourced manufacturing, but yeah.
Right.
I don't think that was fake. I think it was truly appealing enough that enough actual people said, yeah, that's what we should call it.
Right.
But it's a different story when you get a state level actor like Russia, essentially planting assets all over the internet and then spinning up these troll farms,
Yep.
which are essentially warehouses full of people, apparently, just typing away, creating the false sense that our country is more polarized politically than it is,
Right.
and essentially stoking fires and making us feel like we're all at arms with each other.
Right.
It was incredibly effective, and man, they did it cheap. I'll bet that was millions, not billions of dollars
Yep.
equivalent effort,
Sounds right.
which is astounding. It's because our internet has been built on so much trust.
Yeah.
So it's just very vulnerable. So
maybe
it's
we
a big
need to-
question mark about how we're going to keep that trust. And it's either going to be driver's license for the internet or giving up on the internet we know.
Right. Yeah, I think there's probably paths for each that could actually be sufficient for helping us still achieve what we want, like get information, connect with people, but probably takes a vastly different set of structures. Like maybe the Apple, Googles, Facebooks of the world are not really set up for that kind of internet, and we have a little bit of a revolution around how platforms work.
Well, over the past 20 years, both of those processes have played out. So in the sense of driver's license for the internet, sure enough, today you can almost do nothing without a Google login or,
Right.
some identity with some corporate entity. And then in terms of the degradation of trust, gone are the days when you would look at some forum, any open forum, whether it's, an actual like IRC or the comments under a YouTube video or wherever you encounter sort of in the wild free-form feedback from supposed humans, there's no reason to trust any of that as being truly representative of anything, let alone, authentic.
Yep. Yeah. So
we've lost on both those fronts. So maybe you're right. Maybe we'll just sort of lose a bit on both of those fronts going forward, and it won't be one or the other.
yeah, and I think the way so much of the internet is information, which is ultimately like a form of expression or creativity, and as we have more ways to generate human level or near human level creativity, all kinds of like new opinions that were never thought by a biological being may show up, and it might be reasonable opinions to consider. So like there might be just like vastly new architectures of how the internet should work or would work.
So hard to know. So hard to imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, what does an internet even look like where it's populated by vast numbers of sophisticated AIs with ranges of, goals and ways of interacting?
Right. I mean, it felt like a frontier most of our lives. Like the internet always had this frontier characteristic or quality to it. But maybe it becomes this like cesspool that we don't want to do anything with, and we kind of, retreat to our private messengers with people that we know in real life and have one hop away. And there's, kind of almost like a reset in a way. I don't know if it can grow into something else new, but like I think if you and I are on Signal together, I know it's the real you, and it's the real me. And if I talk about, race we're going to run together over the weekend, we know that's real. Whereas like anything on Reddit, I have to call into question to some extent. Like what was the background or motivation of the person in writing the thing they wrote, even if it's a real human, let alone if it's an AI posing as a human.
I think of my own childhood analogously. Where did you grow up?
South side of Chicago.
So that sounds pretty urban. Whereas
Really, yeah.
I grew up in a middle of nowhere suburb of Atlanta where I didn't even know where the limits were. I could walk safely in any direction forever. I was in a dead end cul-de-sac with, knowing almost every kid in the neighborhood. And we were like feral children. We would just gather outside every day, all day. If we weren't in school, just doing spontaneous stuff, going into the forest or playing kickball or whatever.
Right.
And it wasn't until I moved away and started to live in cities that I realized that there was a kind of different world beyond my childhood world. And I had heard about it. I saw the after school educational programs about, don't talk to strangers, don't take anything from strangers. And, like I had the vague sense that there were all these sort of stranger dangers, but I didn't grow up with that, and I didn't have to deal with that as a child. And I feel like that's an analogy to the internet. In the early internet, you could kind of do whatever you want, say whatever you want, and interact with anyone you want, and there wasn't that much harm, no matter what. And now, like, there's just a lot of harm that can be done. And there are these automated bots out there probing every website that's on the internet, looking for vulnerabilities. There are teams of people, set up around the world, working tirelessly to try and place emails and phone calls to vulnerable, especially elderly people, and take advantage of them. It's like a nonstop, Nancy Reagan-esque hellscape. Just, where no one's to be trusted and everyone has the worst intentions. Yeah, just say no to the internet. I wonder if it's just a function of density. Just like, I grew up in this sparsely populated suburb, and on the internet, things got denser and denser. Or maybe it's socioeconomic. Maybe as access to the internet kind of democratized across the world, then people with starker motivations got access. I don't know what that mechanism is, but it definitely has changed.
We've also always had the internet grow up. I mean, the internet we grew up with and that exists, largely today is an internet that doesn't have like a really good value primitive as part of it. It's like information, which is free to transmit, but there's like the counter side to everything being free and always available and infinite copyability means nothing is scarce or rare. And so if we can introduce scarcity into information or communication, in some form, and a lot of different proposals have come out, none of them have really made it, but if we can introduce scarcity into publishing and communication, I think it actually could be part of how a new internet could feel. It could feel different in that it has higher stakes. You can't.
That's definitely
just launch
one
attack.
Yeah. That's definitely one economic factor that would have a big effect. Another one is what social psychologists have been writing a lot about and doing research on, which is this tethering one to another. One of the dramatic examples, again, at that dinner that I heard about recently, was a friend of ours who works in the self-driving car industry was remarking on this dramatic real-world phenomenon of people attacking self-driving cars, even when there are passengers in there. But if it's a self-driving car, people will just vandalize it and do things to that car, terrible things that they would never do to a normal car driven by a normal human. And I think it's reasonable to expect that a big part of that mechanism that causes people to do that is that untethering of the social contract between people. So suddenly it's not, I'm a person walking on the street and there's a person driving a car, but we're still two people who are going to react with our faces in real time and have social signals of shame and, all the rest. Suddenly there's just a machine. And so it has sort of no more value in the social contract than a mailbox does. Right. And so I can vandalize that mailbox and get my kicks. Mm-hmm. And so the internet analogy is, the farther away we get, the more untethered we get, the harder it is for the angel, our better angels to help guide us to the better actions.
Right.
So, we fall prey to those poor decisions and poor behaviors, which spoil the commons.
Yeah.
It happens day to day. I mean, I work at a company, we have Slack. You know what I'm talking about. Like, it just stretches that tether of one person to another, attenuates it. And so you end up sort of saying things in a way that's rougher than you would normally, curter than you would normally. And it's not, people say, oh, it's the medium. It's just text. I don't think it's true. When you're directly text messaging with someone, you're much softer than you are in a more attenuated position. The farther you get from the individual, if you're in just like a forum where you're just saying stuff, like the comments under a YouTube video, you're basically a brute.
Right.
You're the worst version of yourself, and you have to actively police yourself to be, civilized.
Right, especially if you're rewarded for being a brute. Like a lot of
that doesn't help you there.
Actually, further reward you for being witty or funny or mean or something, right? Divisive.
Anything that gamifies sensational reactions brings out the worst in everyone. That's why I try and spend as little time on Twitter as possible. I just think it's geared towards cruelty.
Right. Yeah. I know of people I deeply respect as thinkers, but when I've talked to them offline, and when they come to Twitter, they're kind of their worst self on purpose because it plays to the algorithm and plays to the likes.
Yeah, and it's not conscious largely. I'm convinced. It just does not bring out the best in us.
Yeah,
that's why I'm such a fan of getting back in person, real world, seeing people.
Yeah, for sure. The IRL. It's the I think the one thing that is not going to be replaced by. If there's a last bastion, it's going to be us as humans hanging out together and talking. Right? That's not going to be, even if you have a humanoid robot in GPT-5. I don't think you've got a good replacement for that yet.
Said two people a few miles apart, speaking via servers that are God knows where.
Well, so I want to talk about the AI that you built to host interviews, because we were talking about sort of what it is to host an interview and why these tools are not really credible at being good at this today, and it doesn't feel like it's really close. But we sort of talked about interviewing, the process, and kind of what types of things humans are good at that maybe a GPT or an LLM kind of chatbot wouldn't be. So how did you decide to embark upon this project to try to build an AI to host interviews?
So full disclosure, this began as a conversation at Founders You Should Know with this wonderful, brilliant engineer named Sam Whitmore. And she and I were talking about how exciting, this was as recently as, September. And we were both excited about large language models, but I had like kind of a hot take that they weren't ready for prime time. They weren't. It was overhyped, and they just wouldn't find application soon. And we dug into that, and it turned out to be a really like mutually fruitful conversation. And the upshot of it was, hey, you know what? Actually, there is a way forward that we can both see, which is if we can just give these things memory. Like we were talking about earlier, if you can give them something beyond the what's called the goldfish memory of the moment, and give them the ability to like accumulate life history and recall it and use it in the moment. And we decided on a like milestone. If we can pull this off, then we will know we're on the right track. And the thing we chose as a milestone was make a chatbot that is worth talking to. So, one of the hallmarks of that is it doesn't forget what you're talking about after 1 minute.
Right.
It doesn't forget who you are. It doesn't forget what you care about. It can recall things from conversations you had just like 20 minutes ago. And we had a really clear idea about how to achieve that, and we started coding. And we coded up this thing, and she came up with a great name for it, Daemon, which was inspired by His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. So it's like the idea of this animal spirit creature, which is an extension of your soul. And it was, aspirational. The idea is, if we could really make a daemon that had not only talked with you for ages, maybe years, but it had access to your digital life. It read all your emails. It read your text messages. It knew your contacts. It knew you to the extent that your digital fingerprints reveal you.
Yep.
And could access all that stuff and could reason over it. Then we would have something akin to a daemon, especially if it had the speech and reasoning abilities of GPT-3 and whatever comes next. And so that's the aspiration. Now I'll tell you what's possible today. Mm-hmm. So we quickly downscoped, very quickly downscoped what we were going for, because making a full-blooded conversational agent that you could talk about anything with and, has all these abilities that you take for granted as a human is really hard. And so Sam very wisely steered towards an application, an immediate application that would be a proving ground. And the one that she settled on, she might still be doing that. I believe she's still on this track, is the to-do list. So, everyone knows what a to-do list is. It's like a little file or a piece of paper where you just keep a little list of what you're trying to achieve and you kind of mark things off. It's very straightforward. So the idea was, well, could you make a self-driving to-do list where you didn't have to write all that stuff down? So imagine you have a fully capable personal assistant who keeps the to-do list. Mm-hmm. And you could just talk to them or not. Maybe they just listen in and they read comms and they keep track of what's important and give you useful and timely heads ups on stuff and keep you accountable. So that's a much more feasible downscoped version of a full daemon. And even that is really hard to achieve. That is a mountain to climb right there.
Yep.
Because, if this thing can read all your emails, that's one thing, but how do you know what's worthwhile putting on a to-do list? For, one person's crucial item on the to-do list might be another person's noise and vice versa. How do you know what's actually worthwhile? And that's where I think reinforcement learning is probably going to play a huge role. And so Sam, with her lovely little new startup, finds herself in this technological vanguard. It is such a little nexus of hard problems and really exciting applications. But anyway, long story short, these are early days. And I think it's going to move fast. But as of this moment, I don't think anyone has solved this in any way that's worth getting super excited about yet. But it's going to come fast. It could come from Sam. It could come from OpenAI, probably both. But we're going to make giant strides in this. But right now, what excites me is I don't think we even quite have the right paradigm. I don't think it's enough to just take every piece of, information that you can get from emails and text messages and dialogue and index them and retrieve them with some kind of ranking system and figure out the very next thing to say. It's akin to that thing we talked about where if you replaced me when I was in China as a journalist with an AI, no matter how sophisticated a version of GPT-3 you've got, unless you have a totally different architecture where it has kind of goals and a mental model, I don't think you can get through this glass ceiling of capabilities, which is what we would need to do to have something.
On this to-do list, though, it seems like there's maybe a new UX model that could enable kind of an RLHF, a feedback loop that's specific to the person using it. So, I'm just sort of imagining kind of greenfield, because I don't know all of what you guys built or have in mind, but maybe instead of the promise being that it's going to solve, it's going to prioritize my communication around which things I should be doing, instead maybe it's going to watch me do things for a while and observe, when John Bohannon sends me an email, I open it right away. So if it looks like something that he's saying in an email is particularly important, let's put that up top as a candidate on the to-do list and kind of just sort of be like a observer for a little bit and don't necessarily try to do a lot to begin with, just kind of be present, and maybe over
Yep.
time that kind of UX could feed into kind of a RLHF.
I have the same intuition. I call it the passive data stream. And yeah, you absolutely want some kind of UX that takes advantage of all the passive signals you can. Because that's what we humans do. You know, that's what a really good human assistant does is you don't have to talk to that being constantly. They just observe and soak it up.
Right.
There's all this tacit knowledge they soak up.
Is that also the direction that Sam is pursuing, or is that
at this point you should interview her next, find out what she's been cooking up.
Got it.
I know that she's been working hard.
And so it sounds like that project kind of was a bit of an exploration. Was that like a several weeks, several months kind of thing?
Several months, yeah. My involvement lasted maybe 2.5 months, something like that, all told. And now I'm branching off. I've been working on a related, separate project. I'm trying to automate a different part of my journalism identity, which is answer what are generally called the big W questions. So when something happens in the world, one of the kind of fundamental jobs of a journalist is to answer the W's: who, what, when, where. You know, the basics. Get the facts. This task, by the way, has overlap with lots of other jobs. People in, law enforcement have to answer these questions. Crisis management, certainly in triage situations, in emergency healthcare, national security. Lots of parts of society have this task of gathering the facts. And so I've been using GPT-3 to try and create an automated, simple journalist who reads the work of other journalists or reporting of any kind on events, and then tries to do something that I spent a lot of years doing myself as a journalist, is to figure out what are called casualty events. So people getting hurt or killed. So I was particularly interested in a wartime scenario of how many people were getting hurt or killed by what means, who was responsible, where did it happen, when did it happen. I was particularly interested in Iraq and Afghanistan, but you can apply that to, for example, the United States, and you can get at issues of police brutality, you can get at issues of gun violence in general, you can get at issues of domestic violence. There's sort of all this information spread out all over the country that no one is systematically keeping track of. And mostly journalists are tirelessly reporting on this stuff, but no one is kind of pulling it all together because it's not structured data. It's unstructured data. So it's just blobs of text that have to be applied to human eyeballs. And so I was like, well, we're finally maybe ready to make AI systems that will truly read everything and turn it into things like spreadsheets that could be rolled up into national statistics, regional statistics. So I've been working on that, and I have to say, the very first day I started working on this project, I was just kind of excited, equal parts excited and dismayed at how easy it was to get GPT-3 to do this task of answering the questions. So just to give you a concrete example of why I was amazed. So I've myself have built AI systems that do this task of given an article, figure out whether it's about a casualty event, and then ask the various questions. And they're very expensive because on two fronts. One, data expensive. To make the system not garbage, you need a bunch of training examples, which I had to hand code myself. I did it during COVID. I remember I was walled up at my dad's place over the Christmas holiday. And for a whole month, I just labeled data as my little side project. And so, that was hard. It's a lot of just labeling of stuff. So it's data expensive, but it's also compute expensive, because the way these pre-GPT-3 models work is for any question you want to ask, you need to run what's called an inference. You have to feed a piece of text through this big, expensive neural network, which requires special computer hardware called a GPU. to run in any kind of reasonable time. And those GPUs are, by and large, rented on the cloud, usually from AWS or Google, GCP. And, it's expensive. It's like $4 an hour is kind of the rough going rate for a typical high-power GPU.
Is that like
and that adds up.
A100, like the NVIDIA top of the line?
Yeah.
Kind of
and they're getting, the trend is cheaper, but it still adds up, especially if you're talking internet scale. Because if you've got like, I don't know, on order of 100,000 documents that describe, first of all, you've got, let's say, on order 1 million news articles that describe everything that happened in a particular region over the past year. And then you need to figure out what percentage of them pertain to casualties. So you need to run a classifier, for example, on all of them, which I trained. So that's one inference times 1 million. Then you might get, let's say, on order of 10% that actually describes some casualty, because a lot of news is about casualties. So then 10%, you're talking about on order of 100,000 documents, just to cover one region. You have to run some model that will ask these questions. And for every question, that's an inference. Mm-hmm. So how many people died? That's 1. Who died? That's 2. How many people were injured? Who was injured? What was the cause? When did it happen? Where did it happen? I actually came up with 10 core journalistic questions. So that's 10 times 100,000 docs. That's another 1 million inferences. It adds up.
Right.
It really adds up. And if you want to have the system up and running and like tracking all the world's news every day to generate like real-time streams of this stuff, it's expensive. And so day one that I prototyped a system with GPT-3 to do this, I was able to get a single inference solution. It's so dumb, I'm embarrassed to say it. You take the article, you put it in the attention window, and then you literally say, here are my questions, 1 through 10. Answer them. And it spits out a little document, which is numbered 1 through 10 with the answers. One pass. So in spite of the fact that GPT-3 is this admittedly gargantuan, expensive model, the fact that you can run it, with a single inference means you're already 10 times faster.
Right.
Blows me away.
And you said you were dismayed?
Well, yeah, so I was amazed, but I was the part that was dismaying was, first of all, how much time I spent over Christmas, as recently as a couple of years ago,
right.
Using, what is now semi-outdated tools to solve this, but also just sort of like, oh man, this is really gonna like shake up the world of intelligence gathering. When this stuff gets truly productionized, like a lot of people are gonna have to adapt and find new jobs, adapt in their current jobs.
I think it froze for a moment there, but you were saying that you were dismayed because, and then it kind of.
I was dismayed because on the one hand, I had wasted all this time, in principle, wasted all this time as recently as 2 years ago, using these outdated tools to get this job done, but also dismayed that once this gets productionized, it's going to shake up the economy in a huge way. The information, workforce. I was dismayed that I wasted all this time doing it the hard way. And I was also somewhat dismayed to think of how dramatically this might change the information economy. Like a lot of people are going to have to change jobs or adapt.
Right. I see. So that was kind of one of your first inklings that was going to be the case when you were working on this project. Yeah.
Because it's just so good at it.
And you're, I saw a little demo of a other thing that you built, but that's not. Is that not for
talking about my startup? My startup project,
yeah,
or my startup generator hackathon project.
Yeah. We were dying. It was so funny.
It's so silly. Yeah. So we just had a hackathon last week at South Park Common, this startup incubator in San Francisco. And it was around large language models. So anyone could do whatever they wanted with large language models. And what me and a couple friends did was to make a startup generator. So it takes as input some problem that you have, whatever, with your personal life or the world, whatever. And it will just, in 30 seconds, come up with an entire startup devoted to solving that problem, complete with a website and press coverage by TechCrunch and images for the website. It's very ridiculous. And of course, I tuned it so that the solutions would be outlandish and ridiculous.
And is it live? Like, can we play with it, or it's just it was?
You know what? I spent all of today. You know what's so frustrating is like the machine learning part of this was delightful and fun and quick to solve, and I wasted the whole day figuring out stuff like Apache 2 permissions to figure out how to deploy this silly thing with a Django website. It's like really frustrating. I wish I was better at. I wish I was better at software engineering than I am at machine learning.
Yeah, kind of infrastructure serving.
It's just boring old stuff. I spent all day reading Stack Overflow, like,
oh yeah,
you know, with people having the same old problems for the past 10 years.
Oh yeah, it's a painful cave to be in.
It works beautifully locally.
I hope we get to play. One thing that I've heard from a lot of people who've done hackathons or prototype projects that then sometimes end up getting some attention is that the cost to use these can get really big really fast. Is that something like if you got through the Apache problem and you actually had this up on a URL that anybody could access, would that, you know, and if it got a little bit of visibility, would that become like crazy expensive right away, or would you have a little bit of?
So the most expensive component is GPT-3. So the thing I built is making multiple calls to OpenAI's GPT-3 API. And it costs something like, I don't know, a penny. It's on order of a penny per inference, or maybe less, but call it a penny. That's fine if you have like 100 users using it once a day. That's like $1 a day. That's nothing. But if this blows up on Twitter, you know, it's really potentially ruinous. So that's why I've been trying to make it behind a Django site so that I can keep track of users and give people essentially, you know, every unique user a reasonable number of credits to play with this thing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It looks fun, I think.
But yeah, it can get expensive real fast. Everyone dreams of having the problem of their system crashing because of, you know, too much interest. But the dark side of that is if you're not careful, you can blow through thousands of dollars, you know, in a day.
What if you just throw up like an email collector or something?
That's one solution. Yep.
Even can you do that on like a static site, like with just JavaScript on a static?
Oh, for sure. And you know, one good strategy is to when you have a new cool thing, make sure you give people right up front a chance to look at pre-generated examples, because the people who want to deeply interact with something is always out on the tail. Yep. The bulk of people who arrive at a new thing just want to see what the hell it is. And so if you can give them something that computationally is essentially free, you should.
Right. I think
that's just good design.
I think it's both good advice from a like cost perspective and also a little bit from a UX perspective. But I think it actually has really strong kind of product network possibility implications, which is like, I don't know if you've played it all with, so I think Lexica is an example of this, and
I don't know Lexica.
playgroundai.com. Each of them are basically like, Lexica in particular is just kind of an open search engine for, I think it's stable diffusion things that have been generated. And so you can see the query, you can see the output, and it, actually a lot of times I could do a search and it doesn't, I think the point is that it doesn't hit stable diffusion, it doesn't hit any API. I'm searching across the corpus of stuff that got submitted and crawled by Lexica. But that concept actually has pretty strong network implication for how humans and AIs interact and co-create stuff. And I kind of want to see like the LLM version. I want to see some LLM-like version of that. Like, I want to see what John put into ChatGPT. And then I might want to interact with a branch of that conversation that he was having. And then it's like the interplay between the AI, which is mostly statistical and historical, and like John and DK know something more modern about the world, and so like the interplay of how we interact with it, I think, is pretty interesting and different. Not purely technology; it's also kind of the people side.
What's coming to my mind is the entire website Reddit. Like, imagine that Reddit was populated, by 50% incredibly talented AIs that were proposing topics, but also commenting on topics brought up by humans.
Yep.
That's kind of getting at what you're describing, where, you don't have to take part in Reddit to enjoy the phenomena of Reddit. In fact, the vast majority of humans on the internet who see Reddit at all or know about it, just essentially like are solving problems by looking at the artifacts of previous interaction. I myself have been using it over the past 6 months a lot, trying to figure out when I get stuck with my dad playing this game Baldur's Gate. Sure enough, like tons of people have like discussed it and solved these problems and shared insights already on Reddit, and it's all Google indexed and comes right up in search.
Yep.
And so imagine, this is the challenge, try and imagine some equivalent of Reddit where it's text. That's the medium, but the value has come from not just humans talking to each other, but humans and AIs interacting, or even AIs and AIs interacting.
Right.
And so what would that be? I don't know. That's really intriguing. Something that just came to my mind is I can imagine like explorations, for example, of mathematics. So a really exciting area of math these days is computational solving, sometimes deep neural network solving of problems that are unsolved. So it's a really hot topic. You either have an AI that is a tool that human mathematicians use to explore mathematical space, or, this is really tantalizing, AIs that are just looking for problems. No human necessary to tell them what to look for necessarily. And DeepMind recently, I think it was DeepMind, came out with a paper where they showed that an AI actually made progress on a problem in linear algebra that had proven stubbornly unsolved, and they came up with the best solution. Yeah, and so I can imagine math as a kind of beachhead for this, but you could go beyond math. Any place where there's just a big landscape of the unknown. And so really what you want is a whole bunch of agents, whether they're people or AIs, going and exploring that landscape and sharing what they've, coming back and sharing, their findings, filling in this big map of the unknown. So, that can take many forms. The one you describe, which is image generation, is great because the space, that landscape, that notional landscape of images that can be generated from descriptions of images is vast, effectively infinite.
Yeah.
From as far as we're concerned, and so much of it is interesting. So much of it, it's like so unexplored that almost all of it is to some extent interesting. And so you have this huge search underway, with humans right now doing most of the work, but I can imagine AIs slowly kind of joining us in that big exploration. Something that, is probably inevitable is not just AIs that generate art, but AI art critics. So imagine AIs that are essentially, out there rating things and developing tastes and trying to be thought leaders in the space of generative art. I can imagine following some AI critic whose tastes I'm really excited about because it seems to be really onto something. And I'm like, reliably impressed and reliably congruent with their opinions. I can imagine some virtuous cycles forming where you have populations of AI artists trying to please a population of AI critics, and you get a complicated ecosystem akin to the modern day art scene, where you get niche interests and niche producers, and we get to be the beneficiaries of all this. Right. Letting that huge algorithm play out and just harvesting the fruits of it. And I can imagine a whole second layer like Reddit of just commentary on this world with humans saying, oh, check this out or check that out. And where it gets really interesting is when you can train your own critic or artist. Mm-hmm. And now you have like partnerships in this ecosystem. And where it gets really interesting is when money gets involved. Mm-hmm. No doubt on the blockchain. It's like, there's real money at stake. So people are actually trying to generate AI artists that will convince AI critics about the value of their AI generated art because it has real monetary impact. And so you essentially get this art evolution that's to some extent becoming uncoupled from human cultural evolution. Right. And there, question marks abound. Will it just like run off the rails to the point where we look at stuff and scratch our heads like the art critics did, when Pablo Picasso came on the scene? We're just like, I don't get it. But the AI critics are going banana sandwich for it.
Right.
I can't wait to find out. That would be really cool. Right. Like there's all this money being made and we're just like, I don't get it.
Yeah, and it's actually credible that now that we actually have the ability to transmit and store value just in a cryptographic address, you don't need, you can actually have value transfer with just cryptography. You don't need a financial institution, a bank account, a physical address. And so you could end up with a world where a lot of wealth is actually held by NPCs. Yep.
And it can happen incredibly fast. That's where I think it's especially exciting is if you have systems with no human in the loop, then you can have cultural evolution, AI-driven cultural evolution happening much faster than ours. Yeah. And so you can have these experiments, these vast experiments being played out on just this amazing scale. Let's see what happens. I think it's going to be cool.
So I was going to ask when the AI interviewer is going to finally subset or kind of subsume the role of the human interviewer, but it sounds like you think even grander things may happen even faster.
Who knows what will play out when, but as far as the interviewer goes, I have this dream of launching and for anyone who's listening, have at. This is not a sacred idea. Like I would love to see anyone do this, but I have this dream of building an AI media company, which has at its heart a team of crack journalists, real journalists, human journalists, who are, they have essentially, they're bionic. They have, each one of those humans has their own AI army at their whim. And so, for example, if I did a story and I needed to interview 100 people, about what happened, and it just happened, imagine that Twitter wasn't the hot mess it's becoming.
Right.
And I could spin up interviews with people using AI agents just in real time. 100 interviews get launched. I used to do this in a crude way as a journalist when something was just like really fast moving and I needed to get this story out today. I would do the old trick of mail merging. I would do it manually, sometimes with disastrous mistakes. But, I would essentially send the same email with the same questions to multiple, sometimes as many as 20 people, rarely. Usually more like 10 max. And to have many shots on goal, to try and get the answer to these questions and get different perspectives quickly. And then I would assemble it all together and write my story and go. Imagine I could do that, with 1,000 people.
Right.
Simultaneously. And also have something that would integrate it all and summarize it and properly credit it. Maybe this could play out transparently in real time. You know, everyone knows what's going on and who's behind these questions and why, and it just plays out in real time. It's intriguing. I mean, on the other hand, there's that problem that we discussed of the attenuation of the social contract. You know, the farther we get from humans talking to humans with all the emotions and shame and hope that binds us together, you know, maybe it just turns into a total shit show. It's just information vandalism, top to bottom.
Wow. It's a bizarre future. It's a bizarre future.
Also, what happens when some of those beings that are being interviewed by my AIs are AIs? Well, I don't even know what to call that. Yeah, exactly.
Do you approach, I mean, this stuff can get pretty crazy pretty fast, and you've thought about it a lot. Do you find yourself coming to become more optimistic or more pessimistic about, you know, the future of you and us as humans?
I'd say it's holding even. I'm not more or less optimistic or pessimistic. I'm just worried about different things. I think this is not a like. I think it's just like the nature of human well-being. I think we all have set states, and the details just kind of like sort themselves out. I think some people are just more optimistic than others, and I don't think it changes that much. So I think it's all just so stories. Like, you know, I'm currently terrified of climate change, but on a timescale that I'm not personally that worried about. It all kind of somehow magically works itself out to one even Steven level of anxiety. I think that would change if I lived in a war zone, or, you know, my health were suddenly, you know, topsy-turvy. Those are the perturbations that make someone feel truly different about their lives in the world. But
maybe more drugs. I mean, you know.
Yeah, no, nothing has changed my general optimism or anxiety about humanity.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same. I think I'm much more aware of all kinds of ways that things can get really weird, and I don't really know what. Like, I don't see it as super obviously positive or super negative, but just like very, very different. Like, I almost feel like the whole chessboard is up for grabs in a sense. Like, nothing. If you ever thought anything was sacred, I think nothing is sacred now. You know, there's.
I certainly, yeah, no, I can. That vibes with me as well. I feel like the political situation in the United States over the past, you know, 6 odd years has definitely made me stop assuming a bunch of stuff, like bad things that could happen. I just like, oh no, they really can happen. Right. But also, I think there's as much really hopeful stuff. That kind of, I don't know. It's weird. It all kind of comes out in the wash, and I end up feeling the same. It feels like a physical law. I feel like there's some kind of like, some kind of physical law at play here. Just law. Like, or the law of steady anxiety. I think maybe evolution has given us this mechanism to survive. There's like this kind of rheostatic mechanism, so that you can wiggle around, but you're going to settle on some steady state, no matter what the circumstances. Because I've traveled, as a journalist, I traveled all over the world, and I met people in very different circumstances, rich countries, poor countries, serious wartime dangers, totally like chill, modern life environments for the rich and famous. And the distribution of how people feel day to day isn't so dramatically different. It's weird. Humans are weird that way. You'd think that we would be like sensitive instruments where our well-being and our emotional state kind of reflected reality. But It doesn't seem to. It seems to be much more flexible and adaptive.
And you feel like you've been that basically on the same kind of even keel your whole life? Is it hasn't evolved?
Yeah, with some dips, with perturbations. You know, you break up with someone you love and you're in the dumps for a while, but
Sure.
yeah, no, pretty steady state.
Wow.
So I think that like incredible technological change can and will surely come and change the setting of our lives, that chessboard, but we'll still be playing the game of life
Yeah.
and kind of feel the way we do.
Yeah.
You know, with more or less the same distribution of happiness and sadness, modulo absolute things like health and the well-being of our loved ones and so forth.
All right. Well, I like that as a point of optimism that we can end on.